the Civil War. The topic for our National History Day project played a major role in the Civil War. Not only did it change the war, but it affected the soldiers and people from both sides. The question being asked is, what are the responsibilities of generals in the North and South to choose clothing? Within this documentary, we will vividly describe different factors that affected the decision of generals to choose attire.
Prior to the Civil War, there was a government known as the Union. Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States in 1860. Shortly after his election, South Carolina and 6 other southern states seceded from the Union. As a result, they formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. A year later, President Lincoln planned to send supplies to Fort Sumter, the supply base for the Union states. Jefferson Davis threatened, saying, "If you do this, we will consider it an act of war and we will fire upon you." Lincoln put aside the remark and continued to deliver his supplies via boat. As the Union ships entered the Charleston harbor, the Confederates' cannons began firing. This event eventually led to the start of the Civil War. The first Union uniform was developed by Europeans and the civilians of the North. Both officers' and soldiers' coats were designed by civilians. The basic uniform was based off of the 1851 French uniform, with some alterations. The Union soldiers' uniform was a dark blue and made of very thick wool. The Army was also sent British neck stocks before the Civil War. Also, soldiers were often sent a cotton shirt from their family, while the Army issued shirts that were made of wool. In addition to clothing, soldiers carried a heavy knapsack, a blanket, and a small protective cover. Specific soldiers, such as infantrymen and cavalrymen, had extra slots on their belts for pistols, percussion caps, ammunition, and for their saber.
The Confederate soldier uniform varied due to many reasons such as location, limitations on supplies, and cost of materials during the war. The Confederate uniform was very similar to the Union form until June 6, 1861, when the Confederate Council issued new regulations of Confederate infantry, cavalry, and artillery uniforms. These new uniforms were designed by Nicola Marshall, a German-American artist who designed the original Confederate flag. Marshall was heavily influenced by the Austrian and French armies. The Southern soldiers wore a gray uniform with a frock coat hanging to the mid-thigh. The coat itself and uniform were mostly made of wool and some type of gray fabric. They also wore a gray kepi, or French military cap, which had a flat top. Sometimes these hats were replaced by straw hats or slouch hats. In the last 12 months of the war, Confederate soldiers were best uniformed. They wore a blue-gray cloth uniform that was locally manufactured or made under contract by the British. Although the South had many farms and cash crops, they had a struggle to design and make the Confederate uniform.
To better understand each of these cavalrymen's pieces of equipment is to better understand how they did their job. One of the most obvious things that a cavalryman would have would be some high-heeled riding boots. The tall front on this boot would actually protect the soldier while he was riding through brush. It also protects the side of the soldier's leg and the side of the horse from rubbing up against the rigging that would keep the saddle on. The high heel on the back of the boot would ensure that the soldier's foot wouldn't slip through the stirrup, thus he wouldn't be drugged if he was dismounting or if he fell off during battle. And we also have the spur that was on the back of the horse. Much as a gas pedal in a car, it's not meant to hurt the horse, simply to urge him to go faster. Colors of pants vary, but sky blue was worn on both sides. In fact, if the cavalry trooper was lucky, he might even get some pants with some extra padding on the back to make it more comfortable on those long rides. Hats also varied, such as the kepi cap that Derek is wearing, or the slouch hat that I'm wearing. They not only protected the soldiers from rain and shine, they also designated which branch of the service they were in, such as the cross cavalry sabers on my hat, and the yellow cord means that I would have been in the cavalry.
There were many advantages and disadvantages to each the Union and Confederate apparel. The uniform had 3 major factors that included material type, weight, and carrying capacity. The Union had many struggles with their uniform because they did not have as many resources as the South. However, they did have a substantial amount of wool and metals. They did not want to make the perfect uniform, but something that was durable and could withstand the length of the war. The wool uniform could not take in water or remain wet in such an event as rain. During the cold winter months of the war, wool was a great advantage because it kept the soldiers extremely warm and snug. Also, Union soldiers wore woolen caps, which had leather visors to provide shade from the sun. Although the wool had many useful aspects, there were many disadvantages brought with it. One major downside was that wool was primarily heavy compared to cotton and other clothing materials. This made some soldiers move more slowly and deprived them from energy quickly. Another disadvantage was that wool could irritate the skin. Soldiers would often complain of how itchy and uncomfortable the wool was in the hot weather.
There are thousands here for the 150th anniversary of the first battle of the Civil War, many camping for days with authentic garb and gear.
As you can see, we sleep here through the night.
How's that been going for you?
Very hard. It was tough.
Christine Openacre says the Civil War era woman who watched the Battle of First Manassas wore 10 layers of cotton underpinnings.
Today is unusually hot.
Modern day emergency personnel from all across Northern Virginia are here and throughout the weekend's battle reenactments, helping casualties of the heat.
Over time, soldiers would lose focus and worry about their irritated skin. This put soldiers at a major risk of injury or even death. And since the uniform code was very strict, nobody could alter the uniform in any way, shape, or form, or they would be beaten or even hanged. The soldiers struggled to fight because of the conditions they faced due to the materials of their uniforms. As one African American Union soldier wrote, "I wore old clothes with no shoes and old ripped up socks. I had to sleep in a tent with 4 other people." The Union Army was not supplying their soldiers with the proper equipment. Furthermore, this was another major disadvantage that had soldiers waiting for vital equipment to help survive the Civil War. These brave soldiers were put in intense conditions without the proper clothing and shelter. The Union soldiers had many ups and downs with their uniforms, but it was capable of being used by the great people of the North.
The South were faced with many disadvantages in the war and were unable to buy effective materials for their uniforms. Confederates were now independent and could not rely on Northern supplies and shipments. Therefore, they had to use their own resources to stay afloat in the war and to construct dependable uniforms. They had to scavenge clothing and uniforms from other dead soldiers and even use pieces from Union uniforms. These uniforms were ragged, either being worn too long or handed down from other soldiers, living or dead. This is due to the fact that the South did not have as much money as the North to distribute clothing materials. Because of these factors, many uniforms were ill-fitted, with uniforms being too big or too small, with buttons often missing. Due to the poor quality of their uniforms, the soldiers were at a tremendous disadvantage while in combat. During periods of the war, uniforms were not conducive to the weather. As a result, soldiers were either overheated or too frigid to fight adequately. When all these factors are put in play, the South really did not have any advantages when it came to their uniforms.
The South was fighting to maintain its way of life with slavery, where the North was fighting to keep the Union intact and bring the country back together. Both ideas of the North and South put more pressure on the responsibilities of these generals to choose clothing and uniforms. Without each side's perspective of the war, many of the Civil War components would alter throughout the war, as well as the people, places, and civil rights today.
The conclusion. Now let's take a look back at our question. What are the responsibilities of generals in the North and South to choose clothing? All of these factors played a role in the decision of the generals to choose clothing. For example, the North had many factories and tremendous amounts of money in their banks. This gave the generals of the North a wider variety of clothing to pick from, so they could create the best uniform for their troops. Meanwhile, in the South, they had low amounts of money in their banks, but they did have one of the most important cash crops to make a fine uniform. This cash crop was cotton. Also, the Confederate States did not have anywhere near the amount of factories as the Union. This forced the Confederate generals to create a uniform that was easy to make with no complications because of the amount of factories they had at the time. In conclusion, generals from the North and South chose their clothing based off of the advantages and disadvantages their side had.